Okay, so good morning. We're going to have a joint presentation with our team that has worked on this, this particular study. So it's myself, Carla, Susana, Assuad, yes, and Michel, Waly, Sené. So we've all contributed in different ways, and I really want to emphasize how this has been a group project, and we've really worked with having numerous stakeholders. Can we have this up on the screen? It's there. Okay, so we have really tried to take a very holistic lens on looking at rice value chain pathways in Senegal in applying the TEEB framework. We, as Salman had mentioned, we had worked on an earlier study of rice, actually in several countries altogether. Senegal was one of them, but really just at the production side. So this has been extending this in Senegal across the food value chain. Just to sort of set the context that rice is a very valuable crop in Senegal. It's really increased in importance over the last decades. It has one of the largest production increases in West Africa in the last, say, 7 years. Although the overall rice production increased from 2010 to 2017, rice consumption was increased in a much larger way. So there's still a very large dependence on imported rice. So regional self-sufficiency actually declined over this period, which shows you the importance of rice to the national economy. But we don't just stop with the production statistics. There's the dimensions of rice beyond yields. Rice is traditionally produced around the world by millions of small-scale family farmers. Rice paddies, just among the many different sort of ecosystem services and benefits from rice paddies can sculpt the land. They often serve as a form of water storage and supply and erosion control. When irrigated rice is grown under organic conditions with less or no chemical inputs, it creates its own agricultural ecosystem of unrivaled complexity. Some of the levels of biodiversity in rice paddies are equivalent to wetlands. And rice holds very many unique cultural values for many societies, including in Senegal. So what did we do? You've all been through this application of the TEEB framework. I think it's very instructive to sort of build on what we did yesterday and to say what we did in aligning with the framework and what we did to try and extend it in certain ways. So we did carry out the evaluation across the food chain from production of both irrigated and rain-fed rice to processing and transportation and to consumption. We really worked on bringing in the perspective of multiple stakeholders. Among our team is a woman who's the head of a Women Farmers Union in West Africa, a Senegalese farmer. Civil society, Michel is from ENDA in Senegal, a very esteemed civil society organization. Researchers, a governance think tank, IPAR, researchers, and we really should have the perspective as well of the private sector. I think it would be nice to circulate the report to private sector as well. So we really asked to solicit their input on what are the key issues of rice production, processing, and consumption in Senegal, and to develop the relevant policy questions from many different perspectives. We applied systems thinking, translating the proposed policy recommendations into policy interventions that change key indicators between business as usual, as it is now in Senegal, and an agroecological alternative. So what did we do? A bit expanding the framework was that we structured the policy interventions for the alternative from business as usual around FAO's 10 elements of agroecology. We did not actually go through the exercise you all went through yesterday. We can do this, linking to the 4 forms of capital specifically to rice and their stocks and flows. We used an existing systems dynamics model that was developed for the government of Senegal, which has stocks and flows not limited to the rice sector, stocks and flows altogether, to play out the implications of the proposed policy interventions, and then to assess their impacts on the key indicators of the 4 forms of capital. The form of our assessment is not limited solely to or explicitly to monetary valuation. The assessment is based on the impacts throughout the system of different policy measures as evaluated by different means. And we use the system dynamics model, which Susie's group has developed for the government of Senegal to assess their pathways in attaining the sustainable development goals and the impacts on types of capital. So I'm not going to go through in detail, just to say that these are the different issues along the value chain that we addressed. From the production side, there's obviously very many: mechanization, inputs and subsidies, agricultural credit. In the processing side, processing infrastructure and investment, ownership of processing facilities, with the alternative, as proposed by our stakeholders, of going from large, concentrated, usually government-run mills to smaller potentially community-owned mills or smaller and medium mills, which could have more community ownership and more community benefits. Transportation, rice markets, organization of the market, and then consumption patterns and policies. So I use this as a vegetable lasagna sort of model, that bringing in the perspective of multiple stakeholders. As you're building a lasagna, any one of those layers is not complete and not terribly appetizing. It's really putting all of these layers together and seeing the perspective from many different sectors that adds into what I think has ended up to be a very robust assessment of what are the issues in Senegal and what are the relevant policy interventions. So I'd like to ask Jean-Michel. He was one of our key inputters, and he will just highlight one of these policy areas. You don't need that.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Merci beaucoup. Bon.
Very much. So I'm just going to give a few additional comments on the implementation of the framework. So the TEEB evaluation in terms of rice farming in Senegal. So this is quite a specific approach within this study. We had an initial issue to focus on. This was usually questions of profitability, economic issues. But we quickly realized that, in fact, the issue we were focusing went beyond just those agroeconomic issues. Very simply, at present, we need behavioral change more than anything. It's because agroeconomic issues have their limits. So there are limits to conventional production systems. And these promoted the use of chemical pesticides and fertilizers more in the past. So at present, in Senegal, farmers think that without these chemical fertilizers and pesticides, they won't have good production. There's also the issue of water management. The water coming into plots for farmers is just used for cultivating the rice, but this is ignoring all the other issues related to this, related to soils, related to the crops themselves. So within this study, we went and contacted a multidisciplinary team and worked with them on cross-cutting analyses. As Barbara noted earlier, we approached stakeholders at every level of the value chain. So we asked civil society for their views on the analysis of this issue, because rice farming is very important in Senegal at present. Each Senegalese person consumes 80 kilos of rice per year, according to studies. So really that shows just how important this sector is. As I was saying earlier, we can see that the issue goes beyond just agroeconomic issues. The results of the analysis will help us to provide policy guidance in the future. And this will be carried out through advocacy from civil society as well, and implemented change at every level, we hope. This study was supported by the state. For example, the national program on rice. But we need more guidance to change the conventional system. So I think through the results which will emerge from this work, we will be able to have new lines to take. which take into account the entire value chain from production to consumption. They will have an ecological focus, and I think that by bringing all this together, we will be able to achieve these results. Thank you.
So as we've sort of elucidated, we formed, from this process of the inputs from different stakeholders, we formed a consensus set of policy interventions. And I just, as Jean-Michel has described, setting out the problem and policy interventions, just to give you a bit of a flavor of what then went into the analysis would be, for example, on the element, FAO's element of resilience, supporting, this is the consensus of a policy intervention, would be supporting the construction of dikes and bunds in the lowlands to manage surplus rainwater. Human and social values would be to empower people, especially women and young people at household and community levels, by building knowledge through collective action and creating opportunities for commercialization along the rice value chain, circular economy support for smaller and medium-sized decentralized mills and storage facilities. So that, then, I hand that over to Susie. I'm not sure.
So, thank you very much, Barbara and Michel. Good morning, everybody. So, the work that Barbara and Michel did is very important because it helped us to describe the problem that we try to solve and the policies, interventions that we want to implement in order to solve that problem. But how do you link those two? How do you know that those policy interventions are actually going to solve the problem? And also, how do you understand the dynamics of those interventions in the system and what are the effects of that, right? So what we do is that we use integrated assessment modeling to link them, as a mechanism to link them. So in the Millennium Institute, we have developed a system dynamics model. We call it the ISDG or the T21, and it's a model that is a comprehensive model. So it takes into account the economy, which is the blue circle in the graph. And within the economy, we have different modules. So we have the government, we have industry, we have service, we have agriculture, we have investment, and everything is related to each other. Then we have society, which is the red circle, and then we have population, mortality, fertility, health, education, infrastructure, employment. And then we have the environment sphere. And then we have land, water demand, energy supply, biodiversity, soil. And then they are all interrelated. So this gives us an opportunity to test those policies in a system that tries to recreate the complexity where usually policymakers are when they try to solve the problems. So, how is the process? First, we define the problem and we select the policies, which is what you did, and that process is very important because the stakeholder consultations is the one that helps us understand what are the needs and how are we going to solve that problem. In this case, we use the FAO principles of agroecology as a framework to identify those policies. In total, I think you were around 25 policies. They are all related to each of the principles. For example, one of the policies was to implement agro-livestock integration, to increase the use of land using pest control, to decrease the use of pesticides. I'm looking to Barbara because she's the expert. So if I have her approval, then I say it right. So what we did here is that here we have the problem, here are the interventions. So the next step, because now we have the interventions, the next step is to represent the system. And this is very important because we don't model systems, we model problems, right? So what we do is that we try to understand the different dynamics that are in the system where the problem is present. And we do that with causal loop diagrams. Causal loop diagrams is a very good tool that help us understand all the feedback loops that are in a system. And then, after we have understand how we see the system, how are our mental models of the system, we do that also with the stakeholders. We move to stock and flow diagrams. That's where we use system dynamics modeling. Once we have the model, or the description of the system, so what, right? So now we have all the flows, now we have all the stocks, now we have all the impacts and the outputs. What do we do now, right? So we take it to the next step. So we build the model, and we create scenarios. So we run simulations. So what we did in the case of Senegal was that we took a business as usual scenario where we just let the model run all the way to 2050 without any policy interventions. And then we run the model with the different 25 policies, and then we see the difference. And then we try to understand the dynamics of those differences and what are the effects of those policies interventions in the system. So when we have the dynamic simulation results, we move to the third step, and is when we understand the impacts. And in this case, because we are using the TEEB framework, we look at the 4 types of capital, and we also look at the SDGs. So what we did was that we took the 4 types of capital, we identified 4 different indicators for each of them. So for example, for natural capital, total water withdrawal per unit of GDP, forest land, Jeff Benezif index for biodiversity, and the per capita pesticide dispersion in the environment. And then with those indicators, we see what is the relation with them with the SDGs. So for example, these ones, they affect the SDGs 6, 15, and 12. And then we do that for each of the types of capital. For human capital is average adult literacy rate, under 5 mortality rate, unemployment rate, and human development index. For produced capital is a real per capita GDP growth rate, interest on public debt, yield, so production yield in agriculture, and total agriculture production in tons. And then in social capital, prevalence of undernourishment, population below poverty line as a percentage of total population, conflict-related death rate, and women in leadership positions as a percent of total. And then the linkage of those with the SDGs. So why are we able to do this? It's because of the integrated structure of the model. So that's why we are able to pull out these indicators. In total, the model has around 75, 80 SDGs indicators that we can pull out and use them according to the type of analysis we want to do. So once we have these, we have already an understanding of the system. Yes. So this is the last slide. So this slide shows the results of the model. So what it's showing is the difference between the business as usual and the scenario analysis, or the agricultural scenario. And then the impact in each of the indicators that we measure. As you can see, some of the impacts are more than the other ones. This is because of all the feedback loops that are in the model, and because we run the model until 2050, we are able to recreate feedback loops that take very long time, like, for example, education feedback loops. When there is investment in education, it takes about 5 to 10 years to see the effect that in production, for example, or in fertility rate. So I would like to explain more in detail the results. And if you are more curious, I can show you the model afterwards. And on that note, I also want to tell, and this is a very important thing, and is that all models are wrong. The results that this model is giving us is just an interpretation of how we understand the model. But it's very useful, because the process of getting here has made us understand all the feedback loops and all the trends that these interventions are creating. That is the value added, not the number that it says minus 59%. It's all these implicit things that we learn in the process. So thank you very much.
Okay, let's get seated. I think people are still kind of drifting in from outside. I think we'll have to limit this panel to about 15 minutes or so, 15 minutes. But let me ask an opening question to the three PIs for the studies, which is this. As I mentioned in the opening remarks, although the initial framework in 2014 already discussed value chain and already began to discuss some of the things which appeared in the final framework, there has been an evolution. So some of you already talked about this in your presentations, but if you can maybe talk about, just very briefly for 1 or 2 minutes, how the shift in framework has shifted the way you've done the work that you have, okay? And that's the first thing. So how has it shifted your work? And then another minute on how some of you begun to think about the policy audience, and the policy audience is in the room. They'll talk to you and with you, communicate with you in a separate session, but just any reflections on how the shift in the framework, the expansion of the framework, might have affected the policy audience. So Priscilla, let me start with you.
Okay, to respond to the question on how this new framework has changed how we look at things, I would say the framework at least gives us a way to look at the value chain in a holistic way, which was not there before. Like other things are easy to overlook, especially some of the social dimensions, but with the guidance of the framework, at least you can be able to see everything in a holistic way, how everything connects to each other, and this will in turn affect policy, because a change in policy can have a change in another outcome or an output, which will have another overall change in everything. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for our part, the change in framework, the main implication was that we were forced to spell out human capital, social capital, a bit more in detail and more structured. So before, these capitals they were just a minor part, and now they become more central. So that was reflected also in the findings. Also in the way that we indeed assess the policy options. So we didn't just look at what we could quantify, but we did the exercise of assessing the policy option from all the things that we assessed on the social and human dimension. I think a challenge posed in talking with the policy audience with this framework is indeed in finding the right simple message for different policy decision maker.
So this shift in the framework from what we originally started with to what we eventually had to work with in this segment, I think one of the major shifts was clearly using the whole value chain, and that made it really interesting. It brought in a lot of dimensions and elements that we hadn't done originally in the first part of the rice study. But I think the biggest shift for us, which was stressed in the foundation study, and you don't see it immediately in the framework, but I think some way of making it front and central is systems thinking. It's how important it is to have systems thinking. You can fill in all the cells in the framework, and then what do you do with it? What is the interaction between all of these different elements? And I think I was really glad that we could go in that direction in this phase, and saying it's not easy, but I think to me it was very strong to do that. And I do think that then lends itself very well to messages to policymakers. Yeah.
To ask for, just very briefly, a minute or two, your reflections on what you've heard. I know you haven't reviewed these in detail, but just on the theory of change side, any reflections that you have before I open up to the floor?
Well, I did have the chance to review the livestock paper in its previous incarnation, and I think so just having looked at that and not having looked at the other two, I see a pretty dramatic refocusing and repurposing of the analytics that previously were much more upstream. Although there was a bottom-up study in Tanzania that started the analytic. I think that it's helped to have a much more structured approach that includes all of the four capitals and that enables you to see the relationships between them. What I did miss in that study really was sort of the policy dimension of where you take it from there once you have the information. How are the stakeholders who have been identified within the process of developing that study? And I think this also passes through, although it's already pretty much more clearly identified in the other two studies, how stakeholders have been engaged in defining the variables for intervention and how they can be part of the work that's needed to take it to a next stage. Once you have identified which systems are better on some of the variables that you're looking at, what are the dimensions of say extension, communication, policy shifts, et cetera, that have to be considered, and how can the stakeholders who have been engaged in the process so far be engaged in taking that forward.
Peter, thank you very much. And as I said in the opening to set out the day, part of that response from policymakers happened during the course of these studies, but equally a big part is our reflections in the afternoon session in the DevCo study, which Dustin will lead, as to what you make of these, how you can disseminate them, what you need to disseminate them, okay, to make change happen. So thank you, Peter, it's very useful. Let me gather a couple of questions from the floor. We've only got about 10 minutes, and I'll ask the panelists maybe then to answer those questions. Anyone got any questions, please, or comments? Please, sir, can you identify yourself as well?
I will speak in French, just for a change. I just wanted to make a comment about the study by Barbara and her team, which I would like to congratulate her for. And I was able to read the document, and I will be able to read the document. I'm happy to do so. Rice in Senegal is an extremely important crop. And if there are problems with the government in Senegal, just look at the rice. If there's a crisis relating to rice, that will be something that could bring down our work. So we should be able to we have three principal mandates: to work, to have the species so that we can have two types of irrigated production, and also have species that are adapted to rainy areas. So we can have millet and sorghum as well as rice. Because the issue is in Senegal, assessing the rice production is difficult, because the more people have money, the more they will consume rice, and that's changing from a millet consumption to rice consumption. And many are eating rice at lunchtime and in the evening as well. So the demand for rice has increased. We have no choice in Senegal. We have to work on our rice crops. And personally, we will do everything that we can so that this study is carried out properly, and that's what I wanted to give you as my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, and I think that we'll all agree that that's very much the case, because when we decided on which commodities to focus on and in which countries, that was in 2014, we very much took into account how important those commodities are. We want to work on important commodities that affect trade, that affect livelihoods, and it's very nice that you agree with that, and it's good that we'll have further discussions with Barbara, but she can also respond when we go through. Let me take one or two further comments or questions. Questions, yeah?
Mine is a contribution to Priscilla. I realize your stuff was good, but there has been a little bit new developments. Maybe you have to take note. In terms of child labor in cocoa production, this age-long issue which has been resolved. Child labor per se should not be a big issue because we all grew through that stage. The worst forms of child labor, which is the worst part. But child labor, carrying cocoa in the basket, we don't see it as child labor. And those who did the report, we've confronted them, and I think it's been solved. And then secondly, on the production level, about $16 per certification per ton. It is way below. Fair trade sales give $200 per ton. So it gives a very incentivized farmers, producers to work on cocoa because fair trade issues talks about biodiversity, climate change. So they are more exciting, and they are reforestation, because Ghana, they will have program on deforestation, but now there's reforestation, and farmers before there was a tree tenure arrangement which was against the farmer. Now government are giving way for farmers to own trees, so it helps in the reforestation, and that it's widespread, and there's so many programs that is being done for farmers to own trees. And when we meet in the group work, maybe we could help talk too much about that.
Perfect, thank you. So I think it's more a comment as opposed to a question,
Yeah.
which is fine. Has anyone got any direct questions for the panel that they'd like to ask?
I didn't want to ask that question.
Yeah, please, sir. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you. I'm Tolosa from Ethiopia. I have some questions for agroprocessing, agroforestry Ethiopian coffee. My question is, from your presentation, we have seen that the discharge of wastewater when compared to international standards, they has vary, but I didn't see the national standards whether it is compatible or not. And we have different standards for environment, whether it is solid waste or liquid waste. But in your presentation, I haven't seen. So, what is the issue? That's why the government also knows the issues and the problems to be improved the standards and the legal frameworks. Additionally, coffee production in Ethiopia is mostly around south west of the country, but around the center also some farmers and cooperatives who produce coffee. For your project or pilot project, which part of your project is taking place for policy intervention, also supporting the local community or the cooperative? We have to identify the specific site of the project. This is my question. Thank you.
Our last question. Oh, let's take the one question there. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Céline from Biodiversity International. I have like a more general question, but I will apply it to the rice value chain in Senegal. And it is actually triggered by the question of the comment of our colleague there. If the shift is really away from millet into more and more rice consumption, me as a nutritionist, I have a bit of a problem with it because millet is nutritionally much higher than the white rice and everything they are consuming. So my question here is actually, if we look at particular value chains, like one value chain, just the rice, etc., that will never be enough to account for good nutrition. So my question is, how could the framework maybe be used to also take into account those nutritional shifts? Because in more and more countries we see, even in Kenya here, huge burdens of overnutrition, obesity, etc., due to staple food consumption and so on. So the question is, how could the framework possibly also take more into account dietary diversity and nutrition?
Okay, we'll take one more question. I think Kavita has a question.
Yeah, it's more of a comment for Priscilla. I think you raise a very interesting issue on the trade and institutional side of things, which was brought about yesterday when a colleague from Kenya actually talked about trade limitations and restrictions. And I think when you talked about the value addition that's actually not happening in the countries where cocoa is grown and is shifted to Europe, I think that's a very important story which is part of the system's description. And I think if we can create some messaging around that, it could be quite a powerful case study for framework testing, which shows the links between the systems. Yeah.
Okay, in the interest of time, I think I'll stop it there. It's 20 past. So what I would ask is this of the panelists. We will have a dedicated DevCo session. Now, with the kind of forbearance of the audience, I'd ask not to respond in detail to the technical questions, but if there are responses to framework questions, if you could put those. I don't want to ignore the questions that came, but maybe if we can just keep them in mind, either have bilaterals or bring them up in the DevCo study, because we really have to close this in 5 minutes. So if I can give you maybe 1 or 2 minutes each in turn. So Priscilla, if I can start with you.
I think two of the comments raised were more of comments, which we'll discuss further in the policy section. But he raised questions about the study in Ethiopia, the geographical scope, where we focused on. This was more of a countrywide study. We didn't narrow down to one particular region because we want to provide policies that cut across the whole country. Only we differentiate by the production systems. And for the standards, in the presentation, yes, we focused more on the international standards, but in the policy section, we'll bring the dimension of also the national standards. Thank you.
Maybe briefly, there was no question on the livestock, but a reflection on all the questions, also about scope, like what do you take into account? I want to know why this or that chain. I think also relates to which kind of policy questions you want to answer, for who. And yeah, maybe it's something to, just a topic to discuss during the break, but how do you use the framework? And when do you decide to focus on this question instead of this other one?
Yes, and I very much appreciate the question that was asked, because I think that came up in our study, certainly from the stakeholders, from the woman farmer and from Jean-Michel. They're both very cognizant of what you have said. And I think part of a TEEB framework may be at the very first step is saying how much do we need to increase this commodity versus diversifying. The importance of the government of Senegal has made rice very much a priority, but we've had the input that fonio and millet are two crops that don't receive equal attention and could be very important in increasing in diet. So I think that should actually be the first question that's asked. Thank you.
I'd like to thank all our panelists, if we may, for their time and presentations.